Welcome into another edition of Land of 10 Live. Sam Radin happy to be alongside former Michigan Wolverine Chris Howard. Well, the Big Ten Championship's in the book, and guess who's not going to the big dance?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, Ohio State, they win the conference championship, and it just seems like they keep moving the goalposts back. It seemed like, it was first you win your division, you're in. Now you win your division, not so much.
Well, we'll get into it. We'll chop it up with you guys, and I promise I'll make good on this to tie it all together. Chris Howard and 6 degrees of separation to this year's national championship game. Maybe even less than 6 degrees of separation. I'll get you there. Yeah, I promise. Yeah,
I think so.
I think so. Maybe me too. Before we get there, though, as you can see, we got a busy show for you. We'll talk about Scott Frost and probably the worst kept secret in all of sports, his impending return to Nebraska. Did he handle it the right way, and what should Cornhuskers fans be expecting? We will talk about Ohio State and the aftermath of the Big Ten Championship game and the final college football playoff standings. We're going to talk about the bowl slate for the Big Ten. They do have a tremendous amount of teams in the bowl picture and what all that stuff means. And then 2 things that we've been looking forward to from last week when we didn't get them. Point, counterpoint. It's triumphant return, as the guys in the suits with the other side of the glass there talk about, and we'll get some of your viewer interaction as well with us on our Land of 10 Live Facebook page. So all that to cover. We got a lot of stuff to get to. Yeah. Let's start with Scott Frost. We knew that the move was coming. The way that it was handled, I don't know if we agree entirely, but Scott Frost is back to Nebraska. What do you think about that move for the Cornhuskers?
I think you said it best. I think everyone knew this was going to happen. This was the move for Scott Frost. The prodigal son kind of returns. And this was just something that was inevitable. He had a tremendous year at UCF. He takes this team undefeated. And I think it's only right that he does go back home to Nebraska to try to turn that program around.
Well, and then I guess the question becomes, is this the timing? Is it done the right way? The way that he leaves UCF, coming off the best season, obviously, in their program history, a 12-0 season, and he says that he's going to coach them in the bowl game. Should Nebraska fans be upset? Look, you're paying this guy a boatload of money. Should he be dedicating each and every minute now for the foreseeable future to your team, to recruiting, to getting personnel in order, and so on and so forth?
Well, listen, I think you've waited this long to really get the guy that you want in Scott Frost. It's not going to hurt you to wait a little bit longer. I think you have to appreciate what he's done at UCF. And I think if you're a Nebraska fan, you want to see a guy who shows some loyalty to his program, to those kids, and see him follow through with coaching them to their bowl game and hopefully to a bowl victory. So, if you're Nebraska, I think you've waited. There's no crime in waiting a little bit longer for your guy.
We'll talk a little bit more about Scott Frost. Oh, we're on it today with this waiting a little bit longer and the 6 degree separations. You, the viewers, have to wait a little bit longer, although you can interact with us on our Facebook page at Land of 10 Live. Let's switch gears, at least for the time being, though, to Ohio State. We'll have plenty more on this, obviously. We know the outcome of the game. Ohio State holds on to win it 27-21. College Football Playoff Committee decides not to include Ohio State, the Big Ten champions, in the playoff picture. Did the Big Ten get snubbed?
Listen, I think so. Again, we've talked about the criteria and what the criteria was for to make it into the college football playoffs. And it was all about winning your division. Ohio State won their division. I think they had the better resume compared to Alabama. The only team that Alabama really played that was, marginally alive was LSU, and they lost to Troy. So, listen, I think Ohio State deserved to get in, but I also understand the other side of the argument. They shouldn't have lost that game to Iowa, especially the way they lost to Iowa. Listen, you beat Iowa and you're in. It's almost like prize fighting. They always say, don't let it go to the judges. Ohio State let it go to the judges.
I think the analogy is right, and I don't think once Ohio State lost that game, what we've learned from the committee is that they had no chance to get back into the picture, regardless of who they beat out of the Big Ten and the margin of which those victories were amassed once they lose that game the way that they did at Iowa City. But I think it sets what could be kind of a dangerous precedent to say to a conference champion, hey, wait a minute, you win your conference title game, you beat an undefeated team that's probably a better victory than the team in Alabama that has on their resume, and it doesn't matter. So what are we doing with these conference championship games? We know about the revenue they bring in, but how does it help differentiate one team from another when it comes to the playoff picture? This is 2 years in a row now that I think we've set kind of a dangerous precedent for what we kind of hold dear, I guess you and I as Big Ten fans, Big Ten guys, that the conference championship, that matters. That means something.
Absolutely. It does matter. It does matter to guys like myself that have played in the game. You know, you play at Michigan, you always talk about playing in the Big Ten championship. You always talk about playing in the Rose Bowl. And then you kind of let the chips fall as they may if you're going to play in the national championship. So these championships do matter. I mean, again, the Big 12 implemented a championship because they were left out before. So if championships aren't going to matter, then it has to be across the board. But I think what we have found is that this is a flawed system, and we're still working to improve it.
Well, we're getting closer and closer to kind of the 6th degree of separation, unveiling the reveal, if you will, in the business, because you have a lot to do with kind of the history of how we got to this point. So I look forward to getting into that later on in the program. Before we get there, though, I want to talk about the Big Ten slate in bowl season. We know that's announced. We know about the number of Big Ten teams that get into the bowl picture. Obviously, once you add Maryland and Rutgers, you get to a 14-team league. You have the opportunity now to have this many appearances in bowl games, but it is kind of a banner year for the Big Ten, at least in terms of the number of teams you put into bowl games.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a historic year for the Big Ten, putting in 8 teams. They haven't done it before. So, again, I think this shows that from top to bottom, the Big Ten is still probably one of the best conferences in the country from top to bottom. And when you play it in the Big Ten, especially in that East Division, it's murderer's row. Any team can beat any team in that East Division. And I think the West will get even better now that Scott Frost is there. If he can get Nebraska playing at a high level, then that'll definitely help improve the Big Ten.
Well, that's a fair point. And you look at that graphic that we just had up on the screen as well, and you see some of those games on that second page there. You talk about maybe to some degree Michigan, but mostly the 3 games above that. Certainly Ohio State, Penn State, and Wisconsin. I know the committee is not supposed to do this, and fans are probably a little remiss to do this if they do it, but this will have some kind of impact going into next season, what impression folks have lasting in their minds about the Big Ten if you win games like that against non-conference opponents, because Lord knows, as we're going to talk about later in the show, they didn't do it this year in non-conference games.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, we didn't get it done in the Big Ten. But again, like you said, like you pointed to, in that schedule, you have an opportunity to really make an impression on the Big Ten and really show how impressive, how good the Big Ten Conference really is. Against Miami, you're going to have an opportunity to win. Against these other big teams, you're going to have an opportunity to really improve, to really impress the committee going into the following season.
Coming up about 20 minutes, we'll do our point counterpoint, and we'll spend some time on some of the accolades from the Big Ten season. Next week, we'll do something with some individual honors and an all Big Ten team, and then start to look ahead to some of these bowl games that we can sink our teeth into right after the Army-Navy game and the Heisman, and then everything will get going with the bowl season next week. But before we do anything further on Ohio State, I want to remind you that you can be with us on Land of 10 Live anytime. You're watching Land of 10 Live here on the Land of 10 Live Facebook page. You can join us on demand on Land of 10 Live, and for news, insight, and expert analysis about all things Big Ten, join us every week, 6 o'clock Eastern and 5 o'clock Central. All right, let's talk about Ohio State. Let's get into this thing full bore. I thought going in that if Ohio State won the Big Ten championship game with any degree of kind of a convincing nature, they use that stat game control, whatever that means, that they were going to be in. I was pretty surprised when the unveil came out and Ohio State was not in. Was that your reaction as well? Yeah, absolutely. Again, I really think that has to do with maybe the lack of respect for Wisconsin and Wisconsin's schedule. Maybe the committee didn't really value how good of a team Wisconsin was, and maybe that ended up hurting Ohio State. But again, I was really surprised that they didn't make it in. Again, I understand the loss against Iowa. I understand the loss against Oklahoma that looked bad. But again, they won their conference. They beat the teams in their conference. They beat some really good teams like Penn State. And so they did what they were supposed to do. But at the end of the day, I think the committee looked at
the losses. They really valued the losses, and I think that hurt Ohio State in the end.
I think it's pretty fair to say that when you look at Ohio State's resume, and we're going to compare it against Alabama's later on in the program, but Ohio State has probably 2 better wins, head and shoulders, than anything that Alabama does by beating 2 teams that finished in the top 10 of that college football playoff in Penn State and Wisconsin. Whereas, meanwhile, you already talked about it, the best victory for Alabama probably being that LSU game, a team that lost at home to Troy, and then at Mississippi State, a team that had pretty much an up and down season based on the health of their quarterback play. I think that's kind of unfair to discount the positive things Ohio State did and focus only on that negative of that Ohio State game, or the Iowa game, I should say.
Well, again, and I think you really have to look at the overall perception of the Big Ten in the media, right? I don't think the Big Ten, I don't think it ever gets its just due, really, to be honest with you. Yes, it's been some down years for the Big Ten, but the Big Ten has really come on lately to be one of the strongest conferences in the country. But I really think from a national perspective, they just have not garnered that respect from people in the media. And I think that really hurts them in the long run, especially when they have situations like this.
Well, I want to delve into that in more detail, but obviously it's that Iowa loss that everyone's pointing to as what keeps Ohio State out. That's probably the most significant moment in the Big Ten this year, hint, hint to when we get later on in the program. But almost inexplicably, Iowa dominates that game, and this one game, really this one second half of football, kind of has a pallor over the entire Big Ten season when we look back on it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you look at that Iowa loss, Ohio State coming off such an impressive win against Penn State. You know, JT Barrett having such an unbelievable record-setting game against Penn State, and then to play against Iowa and then to kind of, crap the bed, if you will. It didn't look good for Ohio State in the long run of everything. And I kind of remember back in 2016, same thing happened to Michigan. Michigan loses against who? Iowa. And now they're knocked out of the college football playoffs. If they beat Iowa, if Michigan would have beat Iowa and lost to Ohio State, they probably still would have made the college football playoffs. But of course, Iowa, we already know, what do we call it, Sam?
The Bermuda Triangle.
The Bermuda Triangle. Top-ranked teams go in and come out non-top ranked.
Well, I guess that's a feather in the cap for Iowa, but a thorn in the side for the Big Ten as a whole this year and maybe last year, as you mentioned. I want to get back to something you said about the Big Ten not getting the kind of respect that it does. I mean, let me give you a case in point, and then I want to hear anecdotally what you felt about this. Think back a couple years ago to when Wisconsin played LSU, and no one gave Wisconsin a chance in that game, and they won that game, and that was an LSU team that was probably just as talented or more than this year's team. It's just not fair to judge some of these teams on paper. That's what Lamar Campbell was talking about with us last week, that Wisconsin had gone out there and won all the games that were in front of them. How is that fair to the Big Ten that they're judged that way just based on reputation, whereas some of the outcomes have actually been different? So with that as a backdrop, where does this disrespect come from?
You know what? I hate to point at the media, but I mean, if you look at what the SEC network, you look at ESPN, I think I think everyone knows that they push the SEC, right? I think everyone can agree upon that they really push the SEC. And the Big Ten is not a sexy league. It's not a league that's going to put up a lot of points. It's not a league that throws the ball down the field a lot. And also in the last couple times that we've actually made it to the college football playoffs, whether it was Michigan State versus Bama, whether it was Ohio State versus Clemson, we got blown out. So we haven't been impressive the last couple of years, so maybe that's playing a little bit into it. But I think, again, if you go back and you look at, past years, the Big Ten just has not gotten that level of respect that they showed in the SEC.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but you also have to consider that the Big Ten got that at-large bid for a non-conference champion last year. And the year before that, Ohio State came out of nowhere and dominated the field to win the national championship. So it seems a little bit unfair to point only to ultra recent history and not expand it back at least a few years. But what if you take it back farther than that? When you were playing at Michigan, did you feel like the Big Ten was not respected on a national level? I mean, after all, you might be the reason why we're sitting here. I mean, not you, Chris Howard, but you, the Michigan Wolverines in 1997 with the split national championship. We had to work so hard to correct that, and I don't know if we still have it fixed as a college football universe.
No, I don't think it's fixed at all. I think it still needs a lot of tweaking. I think the committee still needs to go back and kind of reevaluate their criteria, so to speak. But, when I played, it was our focus as a team was always about the Big Ten championship and Rose Bowl. We didn't really worry about the national championship. We kind of let the chips fall as they may once we handle business in our own conference. And I think that's the way we've generally looked at it, and we still look at it that way, because now that you've set the quote-unquote criteria of win your championship and you're in, but now that's not true. So now you kind of have to reevaluate things.
Well, and that's the thing, is I think it kind of changes the mindset for the Big Ten. Just one more second before we go through kind of the top 25 results for the Big Ten and stack up Ohio State to Alabama this year. Just touch on it if you can for a second. Did you feel nationally, was that even a thought, what the national media thought about the Big Ten and your Michigan team in 97? Did you guys have kind of that chip on your shoulder, or it wasn't even in the lexicon?
It wasn't really there. Lloyd Carr did such a great job of just keeping us focused on the task at hand. You don't worry about the media. You don't worry about what they're writing. You don't worry about polls. If you handle your business, then you will see success at the end of the road. And that's kind of what our focus was on. You can't really, again, in prize fighting, you don't leave it up to the judges. But in this case, if the judges' criteria is flawed, then you're going to have flawed outcomes.
Well, speaking of flawed outcomes, that was probably the deal with the Big Ten when you look at the ledger of top 25 games this year. You can spin this kind of a couple different ways, but for the most part, if you look back on the non-conference schedule for the Big Ten this year, they don't have these kind of victories you can hold your hat on the way that, for example, Oklahoma does, that they go into Columbus and beat a team like Ohio State. You don't have these non-conference wins for the Big Ten this year in those first few weeks of the season.
Well, and again, if you go back and we talk about lack of respect, I think that's kind of where you start to point at situations like that, right? So again, but here's the thing: you can only play the teams that are in front of you. It wasn't Michigan's fault when they played Florida that Florida would tank this entire season. I mean, they were SEC, back-to-back champs when Michigan went into that game. So, by all intents and purposes, you would think that Florida would have still been a really good team. Unfortunately, it didn't, and it ended up hurting Michigan. So, I don't really know what the right answer is in that situation.
Well, I think beyond just what you're saying is when you schedule these games, like you're talking about that Florida game for Michigan, that game was scheduled years and years ago. If I'm not mistaken, it was scheduled around 2010, 2011. And at that time, Florida was coming off being one of the prominent national programs in all of college football. So the logistics that go into scheduling these games, I mean, for example, Michigan right now has home and home series with Oklahoma, Texas, Virginia Tech, and Washington over a course of about the next 8 years. I don't know how good those teams are going to be in the next 8 years when they play them, but you got to give them credit for scheduling those kind of home and away series this far out in advance. That's all you can do as an athletic department. This is big boy football. You got to book these things in pretty early.
Yeah, I think if you go back a couple of years, Sam, and you look at when teams were scheduling Furman and scheduling these lower-ranked teams just to kind of get of a quote-unquote practice before they got into the season, some of those teams were penalized going forward because they scheduled those teams. So they were forcing more teams to start to schedule tougher games in the beginning of the season, and I think that's what you saw that when they started getting penalized a couple years past.
Two things on the graphics that were just up there. First of all, you see the graphics of Maryland. Maryland wins at Texas when Texas was ranked in the top 25. That might or might not be the Big Ten's best non-conference victory in the regular season. I'd probably give it to Iowa against Iowa State, who was not ranked at that time, but still wound up having a pretty good season. And Iowa's season was so up and down, but certainly a noteworthy accomplishment for a team that did what they did to Ohio State. And then you talk about Wisconsin and BYU, and it's the same kind of idea about how long ago that game was scheduled and what BYU was under Bronco Mendenhall. He leaves, the program changes a little bit. Obviously, again, that's one of those where maybe you give the benefit of the doubt. All that said, all that being considered, when you talk about scheduling and what you're talking about with respect to what the committee was supposed to do and how the college football playoff was supposed to influence college football, is this telling teams like Ohio State now, hey, what's the point of scheduling Oklahoma? Because even if you lose to them, it doesn't matter, because if you lose a conference game, you're not going to make it in anyway. So maybe we go back to scheduling the FCS teams and the teams out of the MAC and whatnot that don't really get you any big ratings in TV, but they keep you, quote, safe when it comes to going to the playoff.
Again, we go back to it, Sam. I think this really goes back to, again, that this is a flawed system. The goalpost keeps moving, right? It moves back, it moves forward. We don't know what the criteria is. It's a standard 1 year. It's a not standard the second year. So we don't really know. And I think the committee really, again, has to go back and reevaluate itself, really evaluate the criteria and stick to something. If it's moved to a 16 team, if it's moved to a 64 team, whatever it is, we need to kind of figure it out, because it's a lot of good teams out there that's not getting a chance to really perform.
Well, and it's not one of the espoused criteria to look at past year's performances, but I wonder if it doesn't weigh into the back of the committee's mind. Yes, on the one hand, Ohio State gets in and sets the precedent for a non-division winner, non-conference champion to get in last year, but to use your term and clean it up a little bit, they wet the bed, so to speak, in their game against Clemson, and then Michigan State against Alabama a couple years before that. I wonder if that kind of lingering hangover is something on the committee's mind. Well, the Big Ten didn't perform well in this playoff the past couple of times. Their non-conference wins weren't good. We'll just feel safer to leave them out of the picture.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the committee, I mean, I think you're definitely going to look at that. I mean, it's obvious. It's only human that you would look at those situations and try to use that as a metric and evaluate that. But again, my favorite saying is, in prize fighting, you don't leave it up to the judges. If Ohio State beats Iowa, we're not having this conversation. Ohio State would have been in the game. You have to beat the teams that you're supposed to beat. Now, you play a game against Oklahoma, you get kind of blown out, but you still have a great season. You have a chance. You still control your own destiny, and you go against Iowa. And again, like you said, like you cleaned it up for me, Sam, they wet the bed.
Well, let's look at the two teams side by side. I think you can make a compelling case for either one of these teams. I do agree that it's not a clear-cut decision that Ohio State should have been in. And some of these numbers, when you look at them, strength of record, which kind of speaks to the way that the team performed as a comparable team in its rank, in its position, would do against its opponents. And then game control, that kind of nebulous concept we talked about earlier. Those are slightly in Alabama's favor, but the big difference obviously is the yes and no when it comes to conference champion, and that we thought when two teams were closely compared by the committee that was supposed to make a difference. And then obviously the committee's out is to say, oh, well, I guess they're not close enough compared because Alabama was head and shoulders better. When you look at that, do you see like it was obvious that Alabama should have been the choice over Ohio State?
No, I don't. I mean, again, I can make the argument for Ohio State being in just simply because strength of schedule, who they played, their conference champs. Again, that was supposed to be the criteria, winning your conference championship. That was supposed to be the criteria. And what we're learning is the losses matter more than the championship.
I think that's kind of what we're at right now, is that it has a lot more to do with that, quote, eye test, like we've talked about before. It has a lot to do not with margin of victory, but maybe margin of defeat. And that it's clearly a subjective measure. What we're talking about here is 13 people, which we could do a whole nother show on all these recusals and who's not allowed to talk about what. I mean, as if we're calling red phones and talking about nuking. It's ridiculous to me, the level that they take that to. But this is 13 biased people making a subjective pick of who the four best teams are. Anyone that thinks that this is a clear-cut solution to the, quote, problem of determining a college football national champion, in my mind, is just remiss. This is just a popularity contest.
It really is. I mean, listen, Alabama has been the top dog for a very long time. They've been the preeminent team in the preeminent conference, and so they are the darling of the SEC. So I think it is a popularity contest. And also, you got to remember the NCAA is also going to value who can bring me the most money, who's going to bring me the most eyeballs, whose fans travel the best. So all those things are going to be taken into account. And is it unfair? Of course it is. But like you said, these people are supposed to be non-biased, but of course, as we know, that's virtually impossible.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to they're trying to put together a product on television that sells ratings, that sells advertisements. We'll leave it there for today. Before we get to point counterpoint and go back to Scott Frost, listen up, Nebraska fans, on this one. Let's just spend a second talking about Ohio State's bowl future. We do get the Big Ten champions and the Pac-12 champions in the Cotton Bowl? What? That doesn't even sound right.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I want to kind of go back and look at the history of that. Has that ever happened where a Big Ten team is not played in the Rose Bowl? I mean, I would be very curious to see who that was and what year that was. It just seems very odd that a Big Ten team is not playing in a Rose Bowl.
Well, I mean, once you go to the BCS starting in 1998 and you get through the rotation of which teams were hosting the BCS games, and then when it became the BCS championship game, and then obviously now with the college football playoff, there is a precedent for that. Mm-hmm. But I just think that it kind of rings a little bit hollow, especially us. I mean, here we are, Big Ten guys, and you're talking about the message that's given to you at a Big Ten program, maybe the most prominent or one of the most prominent of the Big Ten programs. You're Michigan, you go out, you win your league, you play for the right to go to the Rose Bowl, and now that's no longer really kind of the measuring stick for the Big Ten. I think this kind of, I don't want to over dramatize it, but it runs the risk of kind of changing the fabric of what it means to be a Big Ten football fan. You no longer have the same goals that you did 20 years ago when you played in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is the game is not just evolving from, you know, players and salary and everything. It's evolving from a structure standpoint as well. And it's just, I think it's something that we're going to have to get used to. I think this is going to be the new normal for college football, and it's going to be erratic, and no one is going to like it.
We do this each and every week. You're watching Land of 10 live right here on our Land of 10 Facebook page. You can check us out for news, insight, and expert analysis about all things Big Ten every Tuesday at 6 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Central, and of course, on demand anytime. All right, let's get to our point counterpoint. We left this out last week. How are we supposed to go mano a mano without point counterpoint? We'll do that here, and we'll start off with Scott Frost before we go to kind of some of these crowning achievements from the regular season and then into the Big Ten championship game, obviously about the Big Ten. Scott Frost, how do Nebraska fans feel about this right now with him deciding to stay at UCF? If I'm a Nebraska fan, this irritates me. Here's Scott Frost, who's now, by all accounts, taken his, quote, dream job. I'd be offended if they don't ask me about it. And then, oh, wait a minute, I want to go coach my boys in their bowl game. By the way, it's in Atlanta, the Peach Bowl, and I want to put the crowning achievement. No, first of all, if you're a Nebraska coach, you should be endeavoring all your efforts to coach Nebraska and improve Nebraska. And maybe more importantly, what does this say about Scott Frost? He's the kind of guy who, oh, wait a minute, I got a better job? Okay, great. I'm turning and leaving you. But don't worry, while I wear a hat for another school, while I get employed by another school, I'll still pat you on the head and coach you in your bowl game. I don't like that. It rings hollow to me.
Sam, I think you are like literally holding on to something about Scott Frost. I don't know what it is, but I think you're holding on to something in the past that maybe Scott Frost may have said in 1997. I'm just guessing on that. But listen, if you're Scott Frost and if you're Nebraska, you got your guy. And you have to respect that he made a decision that, hey, listen, I want to see this through. These kids help me get to where I'm at. I want to see this through. I want to be there with them. We're not finished. We have unfinished business. And you just kind of want to see that through. And if I'm a Nebraska fan, I can respect Scott Frost for doing that. I still got my guy. I still got the coach I want. I've waited this long to be a winning team, right? And so I can wait a little bit longer for Scott Frost to get on campus.
Before we move on to a couple of these kind of milestone achievements in the Big Ten this year, I think your point, it depends on two kind of assumptions. One is, obviously, Nebraska has got their guy in Scott Frost. There was no guy that they wanted more for the job, obviously. And number two, that Nebraska is not the kind of school that he would turn around and do the same thing that he is to UCF, that if he has success at Nebraska, that he would never leave them for somewhere else. Is it fair to say that it's based on those assumptions? And is that second assumption right, that if, for example, it works out at Nebraska, he's there for life?
Well, I don't think you can ever say that someone is going to be there for life. I think if another opportunity pops up and it pays him more money, if it's a better situation for him and his family, he might take it. But at the same time, if I'm a player at UCF, and I think I would understand if we had the year that we have, we go undefeated. I understand that my coach might not be here, because if you understand the landscape of college football, coaches are jumping from opportunity to opportunity. It's one of the reasons why people say you commit to a school and not to a coach, because these coaches are always looking for the next best thing. And if I'm a UCF player, I don't know if I could be upset with Scott Frost if he jumps to a better opportunity.
I mean, you played the game, and I know we don't have a lot more time for this. I would vehemently disagree with that. I commit to a school. If I want to go to another school, I have to sit out for a year. Meanwhile, the coach is free to go anywhere else. He tells me, give me your heart, your soul, and run through this wall for me. And then once I do all that and win every game that's put in front of me, he leaves for a better place? No, man.
Well, listen, then you kind of live in a fairy tale world if you really believe that coach. Again, you have to look at the landscape of college football. Willie Taggart just took the job at Florida State. He was on camera a couple days ago saying, I'm the head coach at Oregon, and this is where I want to be. Same thing Dan Mullen said, right? This is the landscape of college football. This is where we're at. If your coach tells you he's going to be there and see you through all 4 years, you better question that coach, because it's more than likely if he becomes successful, he's not going to be there to see you graduate.
I know. I mean, ultimately, you're right. There's no right way to do this if you're a head coach. It's the system, and Scott Frost talked about that. If you can't believe what your coach says, what does that tell you about college athletics as a whole? I guess we're just going to have to leave it right there, at least for today's version of the conversation. Let's talk about some of these Big Ten accomplishments this year. Biggest surprise in the Big Ten this year. Seems pretty obvious to me that it's the 12-0 regular season, the best regular season in the history of Wisconsin football. Is that the biggest surprise, or do you look at something else?
No, you know what? I definitely see that as a surprise to me, because Wisconsin, I mean, they've been very consistent under Paul Chryst. I mean, they've been a very consistent program even before Chryst got there. So I'm not really surprised at the success that they've had, because they've been so consistent. But I think when you look at Wisconsin, you know, they lose so many guys to the NFL, and it just seems like they never have a hitch. They never stumble. They just keep on going. And you got to give credit to Paul Chryst and his staff. I mean, they did an excellent job this year.
I guess the honorable mention there, if you wanted to give it, would be Northwestern. I don't know if anyone saw that coming with Northwestern to get those 6 consecutive victories, to get a chance to finish the season with double-digit victories, and the job that Pat Fitzgerald continues to do there. Maybe that just no longer surprises people anymore, but that's the other one that's in the running for me.
Yeah, again, Pat Fitzgerald, I look at him kind of like a Scott Frost in the sense that he's a program guy. He played there. He loves it there. He'll probably be there forever. He'll probably be like Snyder at Kansas State.
Let's move on in our Big Ten accolades. Of course, next week we'll do some more of this with our All Big Ten team and talk about some of these bowl games. But the biggest disappointment in the Big Ten this year, I don't mean to poke you with this, but 4 losses in the 3rd year for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, and to lose as convincingly as he did against Ohio State this year. That's 2 years out of the 3 that they lose convincingly to Ohio State. I don't know, maybe that's not fair that they lose so convincingly this year, but kind of once Ohio State took the lead in that game, the feeling that I had was that they weren't going to find a way to come back. They definitely lost convincingly in that game to Penn State. So you're looking at a season where Michigan has 4 conference losses. Biggest disappointment in my eyes.
You know, listen, I wouldn't go there. I think if you're disappointed in Michigan's season, then you probably were checking on flights to Pasadena when Harbaugh was hired. Because if you look at how much talent Michigan lost to the NFL, if you really look at where you thought Michigan was going to be in their 3rd year when Harbaugh took over, most people thought it was going to take Harbaugh 3 years just to get to 10 wins, because we didn't know what we had in 2015 and 2016. Now, moving forward, Michigan is still an offensive line and an elite quarterback away from truly being contenders. And I think most people who are really close with the program really understood that going into this season. You can't lose that much talent and expect there not to be a hiccup, or expect to really be competing for a national championship. It doesn't matter 3rd year or 4th year.
Well, I got to put you on the spot then. If you're not going to say that Michigan is the most disappointing team in the Big Ten or the biggest disappointment for the Big Ten this year, where else do you point? Is it just the overall lack of respect for the Big Ten, or is there something in specific that you look at?
I think the biggest disappointment in the Big Ten is not having a Big Ten in the college football playoff. I think for me, that's the biggest disappointment for the Big Ten.
I guess the only other thing that I would think about in that vein is you look at that kind of wave of national prominence that Penn State was playing off of last year, the way that they finished everything off, and that exciting start to the season that Saquon Barkley had, and then it just kind of fizzled its way out. Obviously, there's still kind of an afterthought to the conversation, but it didn't have the crescendo maybe that a lot of people thought it would.
Yeah, they were never really the same team after that Ohio State loss, and I think Saquon Barkley, I don't even know if he had 100 yards rushing after that game. I mean, he had back-to-back games where they held him. I think even Rutgers held him to under 100 yards rushing, which is, my God. I mean, if you can't rush for 100 yards against Rutgers, man, you're in trouble. So, but that was kind of the parallel for Penn State's season. They started off hot. They finished hot last year, not against USC, but they had a great year last year. They come into this year on fire, and then, like you said, they fizzle out.
All right, my man, I don't want this show to fizzle out. We'll have to pick this up next week. I also am a little bit nervous to see these Land of 10 live comments from Rutgers fans after you talk about what you can do to get a 100-yard rushing game against them. But in addition to that, we'll also talk about the bowl games on the Big Ten ledger, talk a little bit about the Heisman Trophy race, where Saquon Barkley winds up finishing in that, and then some more accolades for the Big Ten coming up next week. So we'll do that and more. Thanks a lot to everyone who helps put the program on the air. We're back next week for another edition of Land of 10 Live.